Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Book 2, as Balbus continues making his arguments for the reality of some divine providence flowing throughout the entire universe, ordering it, regulating all of it, one of the argumentative strategies that he's going to employ is something that I think many people in the present and in the late modern period are quite familiar with. It's heaping up all sorts of examples by looking at things in the world and saying, aha, there must be some sort of intelligent designer, arranger, orderer, however you want to think of it, who created them this way. And so there's a vast scope of living things that figure into this. And the Stoics are going to think about this primarily in terms of plants and animals, two different degrees of being, with plants being a lower degree, animals being a higher degree. If they knew that fungi were a different kind of thing, neither plant nor animal, they probably would have included discussion of that as well. And we could say that about other orders of life, by analogy as well. So he says to come from things celestial, things heavenly, to things terrestrial, that is, of the earth, which is there among the latter that does not clearly display the rational design of an intelligent being? Now, the word design is not actually in there. It's being sort of interjected in the translation, we could say. But what we can say is that Balbus says that these show us that, aperiat, there appears in them the reason, the ratio, the faculty of reason, or the effects of reason, of some sort of intelligence or intelligent being, intelligentis, right? So it's not just that there is reason, it's some intelligent thing that has reason and used it to make all of these. And he's going to begin with plants. He's not actually going to talk that much about them, but there's a short paragraph here. He says, think about the vegetation that springs from the earth. The stalks both give stability to the parts which they sustain and draw from the ground, the sap to nourish the parts upheld by the roots. So we've got sap, we've got roots, we've got, as he's going to talk about, trunks. Trunks are covered with bark or rind, the better to protect them against cold and heat. And then we have vines that cling to the props with the tendrils as with hands and raise themselves erect like animals. And then he brings up a kind of curious thing. He says, if they're planted near cabbages, they will shun them like pestilential and noxious things and won't touch them at any point. So what's going on there? There's a kind of intentionality, even among things that don't seem to have intelligence, in how they work. So plants, okay, that's one set of living things. Then he turns to animals, and he's going to have a lot more to say about animals, which, by the way, later on in the discussion, he's going to say, we've got all these examples from Aristotle, in his works. Aristotle was very interested in how animals work, their behavior. He's got a couple works on that. Actually, by the way, Theophrastus, Aristotle's student, whose works would have been available, wrote a lot about plants along analogous lines. All right, back to animals. So he says, what a variety, how many kinds, right, of animals there are and what capacity they possess of staying true to their various kinds, their genera, right? Their genus, we would say, or their type. And what is this going to take the form of? Well, one is that they're protected in many different ways. Some have hides, some have fleeces, others have spines, some have feathers, some scales, some are armed with horns, some are equipped with wings to escape their foes, right? And then he also says, nature is so plentiful, it gives every animal the food that is appropriate to it, right? The food that is suited to it, aptus erat. Now, interestingly, for these animals, a lot of that food is going to be these plants, but a lot of it's also going to be other animals, right? So nature is providing each animal with its nourishment, but it just so happens that many of the animals, its nourishment is some other animal, which may not be entirely happy about being turned into food. And so he goes on and he says, I might show in detail what provision has been made in the forms of the animals for appropriating and assimilating this food, but nature has also bestowed on these beasts two other things that are really important that lead them to the food. So one is sensation, sensum, in this case, sensus, and then desire, appetitum, appetitus, right? And why are these important? So it's not just that nature says, all right, you eat this, you eat this, you eat this, go to it. They need to have faculties that are going to lead them to that. So he says that the one is to arouse in them the impulse to appropriate their natural foods. So they need desire to lead them to actually eating things. The other to enable them to distinguish things harmful from things that are healthy, salutaribus, right? Pestifera salutaribus. And so each of them has its own particular ways of grasping these things. And then he talks about nature giving each of them different gifts for getting their appropriate food. And he's going to go through a lot of examples, which we'll run through fairly quickly, right? He says some animals approach their food by walking. Others crawl. Some fly. Some swim. Some seize their nutriment with gaping mouth and with the teeth themselves. Others snatch it by their claws. Others with their beaks. Some suck. Some graze. Some swallow it whole. Others chew it. Some are of such lowly stature they easily reach their food upon the ground with their jaws. Taller species have long necks. The elephant is even provided with a hand, namely its trunk, right? Why? Because it was difficult for them to reach their food because of the bulk of their body. And then he talks about animals that eat other animals. Those whose mode of sustenance is feeding on other animals got strength or swiftness, so they can catch them and eat them. On certain creatures, there was even bestowed a sort of craft, machinatio, or cunning, solertia. Who does he use as an example? Spiders. Spiders are pretty fascinating creatures. I'm actually, as a side note, an arachnophile because I like that cunning and art that they show in hunting their prey. He talks about webs. We could also think about the hunting spiders. Then he even talks about mussels, and he brings up a kind of symbiotic relationship here. He says the mussel is a large bivalve which enters into a kind of partnership with the tiny shrimp to procure food. When little fishes swim into the gaping shell, the shrimp draws the attention of the mussel, and the mussel shuts up its shells with a snap. Thus, two very dissimilar creatures obtain their food in common, right? And then he says, there's also aquatic animals born on land, for example, crocodiles. And we often place duck's eggs beneath hens. This shows us because the duck's eggs hatch, they're attached to the hen for a little while, and then they see water and they're like, that's what I want. All of the animals are driven by certain inborn instincts, programming, if you like, if you prefer that modern term. And nature has given that to them in terms of desire and sense so that they can go and get the food that they need. That's not all that they have an instinct for. There's also a drive to keep themselves secure as well. We don't need to go over every single example that he gives. We can move on to this. He talks about precautions taken by animals for their security, right? So custodiat, that they guard themselves. For example, when they are keeping a watch while they are eating. Circumspectant, they look all around while they're eating their food. He says, some hide in their lairs. And then there's other ways in which animals preserve themselves. Dogs cure themselves by vomiting, eating things that are going to make them sick, and then they purge themselves. Ibises, a kind of bird in Egypt, do this as well. And he says, by the way, we human beings only discovered this recently. Panthers, which are caught by poisoned meat, have a remedy which they employ to save themselves from dying. Wild goats in Crete, when pierced with poison arrows, seek an herb called dittany, and on swallowing this, the arrows drop out of their bodies. So all of these are ways in which animals are, so to speak, protecting themselves. If Cicero knew about it, no doubt he would talk about the monarch butterfly feeding upon poisonous plants to make its own body poisonous and signaling this to the birds that might otherwise eat it with its brilliant orange color, right? So we could go on and on about how animals keep themselves secure. What is going to be the upshot of this? He says, in order to secure the everlasting duration of the world order, the perpetuus mundi, right? Then divine providence, and he's using that, providentia deorum, the providence of the very gods themselves, ensures the perpetuation of types of animals, bestiarum generum et arborum omniaque rerum. So it's going to ensure that all of these plants, animals, are continuing on. And he says the latter all contain within themselves seed, and that is the vegetables, right? And as it turns out, animals have seeds too. We call that, well, nowadays we understand that there's usually, for sexual reproduction, an egg and a sperm cell, right? Also even for plants. But there's sexual reproduction that is going on. And this, to the Stoics, shows us a rational design of some sort. So he says some are male and some are female, a device of nature to perpetuate the species. That's why we have sexual differentiation, so we can have reproduction. Parts of their bodies are skillfully contrived to serve the purposes of procreation and conception. Both male and female possess marvelous desires, isn't that a nice way to put it, for copulation, for getting it on, right? And when the seed is settled in its place, it draws all the nutrient to itself and fashions a living creature. When this is dropped from the womb and has emerged, some creatures do something special. He talks about mammals. Mammals nurse their young. And here he even has another interesting observation. You can tell that things are providentially arranged because some mammals have more nipples than others. So animals that are going to have large litters have a lot of nipples. Human beings who don't have that many, just 2 of them, right? Unless you're born with a third extra one or something like that. So, presumably this shows that there's some sort of providential design at work. Once the animals are actually born, they're also protected by their, at least in some cases, he talks about turtles and crocodiles that let their young hatch and rear themselves, but birds take care of their young for a while, right? They protect the chicks with their wings so they won't be injured by cold and shade them against the heat of the sun. But when the young birds are able to use their sprouting wings, the mothers escort them in flights and then they're released from that. Whereas, some other animals might continue on this adolescence for a longer period of time. All of this, according to the Stoics, shows not just a kind of intelligence in these animals, but forming these animals themselves. So all of these living things display the effects of a rational and intelligent providence according to the Stoics.